Hey, everybody. So when I was in college, I was told there are two paradigms when it comes to people and nature. One where people are nature, the other where we're separate from nature. And this was something to debate and something to think about, which is obviously a silly idea. We're obviously a part of nature. We always have been and always will be. The only conversation to have is our relationship to nature, that relationship to land. And that differs between cultures. We tend to think of knowledge as building blocks stacked on one another, where we are constantly learning, but it appears over time, knowledge is more like water, constantly moving and sometimes evaporating. So today, I'm happy to present my dear friend, Dr. Michael Dunaway, a member of the Choctaw community, an expert on Indigenous energy sovereignty, and will be our curator here to discuss Indigenous wisdom and the broader climate change impacts for Indigenous communities. Michael, it's good to see you. It's been a couple of years, buddy.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And thank you for allowing us to present. A few things about Indigenous communities and climate change impacts. So like everyone else, the changes in temperatures and precipitation, will change the dynamics of how land is used. And one of the things that is different for Indigenous communities is in the past, they would be able to move as an adaptation strategy. They would follow the animals, they would follow the plants, and were able to engage with their own traditional ecological knowledge by moving with the changes in nature. But because of colonization, they're becoming locked into these places that the ecosystems are going to start rapidly changing. So they have to start coming up with different adaptation strategies. So some of the issues like food, water, expenses, energy costs, things like that are going to disproportionately impact Indigenous communities because they don't have a lot of resources to begin with. They have a lot of social issues that make things more difficult for change. And then on top of that, they're not going to be able to use their own ecological knowledge to adapt to these new situations. So one of the things about the movie that we just watched was the kind of concept of the coevolution of land and raising up with the land. And Indigenous people have been managing these ecosystems since before contact. And so what that farmer and rancher was trying to get back to is what Indigenous people had been doing before contact. And they still have those knowledge systems. They still have that information that they can use as a foundation for their own adaptation strategies. And because of that, they can be the leaders in how to adapt to changing climates for other communities. So for example, they share a lot of similarities with places like small agricultural areas. They can't just pick up their farm and move, it's far too expensive. So how do you change? How do you do things like restorative farming? Indigenous communities have those knowledge systems that can help feed into that. And for my work, I work with renewable energy. So how can we get tribes to become energy independent? And on one aspect, it's a climate change adaptation strategy because it helps reduce carbon and things like that. But it also addresses social issues like energy costs. And when a community produces resources and are in control of those resources, they can determine what happens with those resources, who profits from those resources, who benefits from those resources. And right now, a lot of tribes, they make money through casinos or other development ventures, but those funds are going off the reservation for things like energy costs. And so it's hard to create the type of wealth that's needed to not only be able to make a community successful and grow and thrive, but to be able to have the resources to deal with issues like climate change, because it's going to take a lot of different resources to be able to address climate change impacts. In addition, solving a problem like energy helps solve other problems like food issues and water issues, because those issues are linked, especially with indigenous communities. So by addressing energy, it opens up the foundation to address food issues. So a renewable energy project can do something like create a foundation for things like sustainable gardening and create the healthier food options using traditional ecological knowledge and the foods that the community evolved with and that are better for their own health. That increases their health. In addition, doing issues with energy and food affects water and how water is used, and limits things like, pollution runoff and things like that. So it's not just a climate change issue working on things like energy or food. It's also a lot of other social impacts that are incredibly important for tribes, because when a lot of people talk about climate change, they talk about future impacts, or we're just now starting to see the impacts. But for indigenous communities, we've been dealing with these impacts for the past 10, 20 years, because they're so disproportionately affected by things like rising energy costs or soil degradation or non-point, non-source point pollution issues. And so they are in the best position to be the leaders to demonstrate how change can happen in small communities that can lead to bigger solutions across the board. And one of the things that these communities really need are allies, people who are willing to come in and say, we want to be a part of the solution, and here's how we can be a part of the solution now, and work with you and partner with you, and not try to take over, but be willing to listen to what you have to say and learn from you in order to create positive solutions that help everyone. And so with these communities, one of the issues that they're facing is that this is yet another threat to their livelihoods and their lifestyle and their culture. And so by embracing their own culture to find solutions forward, it helps preserve the culture that they have worked so hard to maintain through so many other colonization efforts. And so it's a way to find a new normal moving forward and not focus on the negatives of the past, but the solutions moving forward and how to kind of heal forward, not just the wounds of colonialism, but how healing those wounds can create solutions to climate change issues for non-Indigenous communities. So for me, it's important to work with Indigenous communities because that's where the greatest change can happen immediately, because they need solutions now. They can't wait for solutions that happen tomorrow or a year from now or 10 years from now. They need to find solutions that work right now with the resources that we have. And eventually, other non-Indigenous communities are going to be in that position. And Indigenous communities can be at the forefront saying, we're the vanguard, we're the ones who are fighting this, even though we did not cause these issues. We are not the ones who have been the major contributors to this. We're the ones that are having to pay the bill yet again for the decisions that happened from other communities. So I'd like all of you to think about those things as Ma'Ko'Quah and Mark are talking, and then we'll address questions at the end, the three of us, that we'll answer through the chat. But I don't want to take up any more time, and I'd like to ask Ma'Ko'Quah to step in and talk about the work that she's been doing.
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out this technology. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Dunaway. I appreciate being asked on this panel. So my name is Ma'Ko'Quah Jones. I work with tribal communities. I worked in my tribal community for 4 years on non-point source pollution. And I have a background in environmental law and policy from Vermont Law School. And so today I want to talk about work being done on the ground. There's a lot of research being done, but the work on the ground is where it's at right now. I've worked with the Prairie Band Potawatomi community, the Ojibwe community, and we have worked on climate action plans. What does a climate action plan look like for a tribe? So we take these anecdotes that Dr. Dunaway speaks about, and we have to put it in place, implement it on the ground. We're talking about best management practices. We're talking about redefining environmental labels. So with the Prairie Band Potawatomi, they redefined what a wetlands is based on their traditional cultural knowledge. So we take this term, traditional ecological knowledge, and we have to implement it in the communities addressing different distinct cultural values. So we did wetland restoration. That was part of the climate action plan. And the reason why tribal climate action plans are different, what I find are different than, say, municipal climate action plans, is there's a lot of community engagement going on with tribal communities, and they really value whether the community supports them or not. And so you have to build that community engagement at every step of the way. Now, the mainstream way to do these climate action plans is to bring scientists in, and what they do is identify vulnerabilities. And so what particular vulnerabilities does this tribal community face in the face of climate impacts? And so, you get input from the community, you get buy-in from the community. It's not going to be effective unless there's community support there. So what I did is took one of the tribe's climate action plans, or waste and response plans, and in the city of Lawrence here in Kansas, we use that as a guiding step for how to develop a municipal climate action plan that involves the community support. It's not effective unless it's accessible to the community. And so we have a municipality now, City of Lawrence, that's using tribal climate action plans as a guide. And that's going to be adopted by Douglas County too. And so I think that that's important work that's going on the ground. We take these, theories that researchers do, and we have to put them in place on the ground. One of the things that we need, one of the possible solutions that we need as Indigenous peoples, is policy that protects our cultural values, our land practices, our rights to the land. And that right there is like the bones of what Indigenous communities need. We need an overarching policy that directs resources to the most vulnerable tribes to build what we call adaptive capacity. Dr. Dunaway has worked on a pathway called poverty to sovereignty. He mentioned energy sovereignty. Well, what does that look like? What does that look like on the ground? And so we need these overarching policies for Indigenous peoples. Each community is working in a silo right now. Some of them aren't even working together. They're just doing research on their community. How can we take that and implement it into policy? And so my work is starting to look at how we can quantify these anecdotal values. What does it mean to be sovereign? What does it mean to be sovereign for your land, for your environment, for your food, your energy? We need to quantify that, put it into an index, and identify the most vulnerable communities and direct resources to those communities. That is one of the solutions that is needed that Dr. Dunaway talks about. And so that's what I'm working on, is a federal policy where they can direct these resources, and you can identify the vulnerabilities based on this index, and direct resources to these communities, build that adaptive capacity, and build their resilience in the face of climate change. They're already working on this on the ground. There's people like me that are working like this on the ground, implementing these values into water quality issues, into soil issues, Everything reflects the cultural values of this distinct communities, and that needs to be factored in when you're talking about policy. However, Indigenous communities have commonalities. And so these commonalities, if you take them from these communities and put it into a policy, the commonalities of Indigenous communities, then you can have an overarching policy that helps a lot of Indigenous communities. I'm not going to say all, but a lot of Indigenous communities. And that's one of the solutions, the practical solutions that we need on the ground. And so I think that the work that I do complements what Dr. Dunaway is studying in his work. But I'm going to introduce Mark Junker, who also works for a tribe. And he's the one who wrote the climate action plan that I used as a guiding tool for the city of Lawrence and Douglas County. And so I'm going to turn it over to Mark Junker.
Hello, my name is Mark Junker. Good afternoon. I am the Tribal Response Coordinator for the Sac Fox Nation of Missouri and Kansas and Nebraska. And this is an interesting forum. I'm used to generally speaking with regulators. And so having a general population on a Sunday afternoon is really pretty nice. I appreciate the opportunity to talk about some of the things that we've been doing with the tribe, and not just with the Sac Fox Nation, but also with the other tribes around us. It's a community that is really committed to making some sort of a difference when it comes to dealing with climate change. Not just within the tribes, but in the communities at large. And one of the things that we're constantly, being asked about to incorporate, it's really on a lot of people's minds, is the idea of traditional ecological knowledge. And within our own communities, it's just knowledge. There's really no, magic formula to putting things together. I think the traditional ecological knowledge that benefits the most is just kind of an awareness of exactly how we fit into the system. And I thought Dr. Dunaway mentioned it perfectly when he said, we're meant to be a part of the land. We're not meant to be separate from it. The idea that we should set aside certain parts of land and never touch it again for future generations is not something that's really viable. And I think we're learning that in California. The other thing that the tribes really see as a need is acquiring data that is pertinent to them and being able to share it, and deciding who we're going to share that data with, whether we're going to keep that internally, whether we're going to make that part of the big picture. That's going to be a sovereign decision that's determined by the tribe, and is a conversation that we're having at a lot of different levels right now. And when we have that data, we can begin making risk assessments that are tailored to specific tribes, and not just some sort of general idea of what the state is doing, or maybe what the region is doing, or what a county is doing. These risk assessments are designed to look at things that the county isn't necessarily have to deal with a history of colonialism. The tribes deal with that on an entirely different level. And then we can look at mitigation projects and strategies, all sorts of different planning, and be able to respond. A couple years ago, when we met with the Adaptation Forum in Madison, the hashtag resilience was postulated by Nikki Cooley and some of the people at the Institute of Environmental Professionals in Flagstaff, Arizona. And I don't know if it's necessarily taken off, but I do check it once in a while to look for ideas that people may have. Looking at where the Sac Fox Nation came from, this is the Midwest region, Northern Illinois, Southern Wisconsin. This was the Sac Fox homeland up until the early 1800s, when after the Black Hawk Wars, we were forced west. Today, our tribal headquarters for the Sac Fox Nation of Missouri are in Reserve, Kansas, about 100 miles north of Kansas City. But there's Sac Fox that also have communities in Oklahoma and in Tama, Iowa as well, over by Des Moines. And so when we start looking at some of the strategies that we have for acquiring data, one of the first things that came up was the idea of having a drought early warning system. And it's still basically a spreadsheet, but it's got about 15 different sources of data that we use, everything from deviation from normal precipitation to just some phenological observations that we'll make throughout the year. We've got a pretty decent baseline understanding of where our normals are and some of the natural progression of cause and effect that we see. Our two biggest concerns right now when we look at risk are flooding and tornadoes. Tornadoes are kind of hit and miss, but we do know that when they come through the reservation, they can be devastating. The history of reserve documents 2 times when the town's been virtually wiped off the face of the map. And so this drought early warning system isn't really going to do much with the tornadoes, but it does help us get an idea of what our flooding potential is. We have 2 major causes of floods, and those would be from dams upstream on the Missouri River and flash flooding, which we've noticed we're getting way more frequently severe incidents of. Just in the past 4 years, we've had 2 flash flood events that both, for all intents and purposes, closed down our community center with sewage, which is not really fun to talk about. This led to the development of mitigation plans, doing things to prepare our community in the event of climate changes that are coming, and it's a matter of now acquiring the funds and the community will to see some of these projects through. One that is now moved to the top of the list is reinvesting in our community center to be able to withstand some of the flash floods that we're having. So that means improving some of the doors. It means improving the stormwater capacity of the drainage, and it means improving the roof as well. But we're hoping to have a community center that will be able to serve a lot of different purposes, not just as a meeting place, but as a place for people to go to in times of trouble as well. And the planning for that goes on constantly. One of the things we've come up with regional wide is the idea of climate summaries, and these are put out quarterly so that the conversation is something that's ongoing. We can put topical events in it and at the same time have it very much a record of what's going on. And when things are going normal, you know, it's nice, and it has people realizing that, hey, what's happening now isn't necessarily catastrophic, but it goes along with the trend that the national climate assessments have been predicting, in that we're going to become drier, but our total rainfall isn't necessarily going to change that much annually. We'll see more frequent flash flooding events. And so as we document those and share what's happening, we see strategies arise that begin to look at solutions to those problems. And of course, we're always having to respond. And when we talk about, you know, the changing climate and the more frequent storms, I kind of want to see if this will actually play. The idea that, you know, we can do things to stop it from happening. And I think that sounds messing up a little bit here. Change them. We can do things to be more proactive, and whether that's building things in a more sustainable manner, whether it's investing in the infrastructure of the community, being prepared. This is an incident that we called a short-term Directo, and it's the 3rd one we've had in the region. This is the 2nd of 3 we had in the region in the last year, which happened down at our truck stop. And over a period of about 25 seconds, you'll see the canopy literally being ripped off its foundation. by a gust of wind that came by, it took out power to our entire community of reserve for about 48 hours. And normally you don't think of that as being too catastrophic, but we have a lot of people that require oxygen, and the temperatures were over 100 degrees during this period of time. So it was important for us to be able to respond. And we have the ability now. This is something that we probably wouldn't have had a couple years ago, because we realize that the climate is changing. We're ready to have those conversations at a moment's notice and hopefully begin to adapt to the situation and improve it as time goes on. And I'll wind up here and pass it over to Dr. Dunaway and Ma'Ko'Quah. Thank you.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it. We're all going to come back, and I'm going to see if I can set it up so we can look at some of the Q&As. We have one question about Indigenous Australian knowledge being implemented into restorative practices. Did either of you see anything in there that aligned with Indigenous practices that have been going on with your communities or communities that you work with?
I would say there's some commonalities. I've done some research on Tuvalu, on the small island nations. I haven't studied Australian and Aboriginal Australian issues, but when I talk about commonalities, I've seen that in other communities, particularly about displacement, which is something that we worry about here. Working on the ground, you know, are our communities going to be able to subsist? Are they going to be able to stay in this area? You know, displacement doesn't just happen on the coast, it happens inland too. Drought issues like Mark mentioned. And so, so yeah, there are those commonalities that exist. There is research being done. That's not particularly my field of research, but in studying global Indigenous people, then you know, we're talking about First Nations, we're talking about New Zealand, Tuvalu, Samoa, and there I found a lot of commonalities.
Okay, Mark, did you have something that you wanted to?
About the one thing that kind of stands out, and I don't know specifically, but just kind of the awareness that he has is very much, you know, kind of a more Indigenous view, realizing that the earth you have, it's holistic. You can't just look at one component, you know, and, you know, adding doses to the soil to make it function and control every single aspect of it. The environment was built to work together, and the idea of monoculture is really something that is foreign to the Indigenous mindset, I believe.
Yeah, that resonated with me as well. So the concept of like traditional ecological knowledge and how these systems aren't independent of human action, and that one thing that is a little bit different with Indigenous communities is that Indigenous communities tend to look at things like farmland and forests and things like that as a series of relationships instead of a series of resources. And so they don't look at it as managing resources, but living in cooperation and not being separate from nature, but working together along with those kind of natural systems. And I think that was one of the things that the farmer was trying to get back to, was those knowledge systems. So we've got another question about aquaculture opportunities and Indigenous knowledge in communities, and how can we kind of scale up some of the efforts that are being done. So I think, Mark, I think that's all you.
Yeah, I have actually seen a couple of projects done with this in conjunction with brownfields in Kansas City. And there are some instances where tribes are using, I believe in the Pacific Northwest especially, and I know Coeur d'Alene has some aquaculture going on. It is, I hate to say new because it's been going on a while, but it is new to me. It's something I'm very interested in. The fish that they were using in Kansas City is tilapia, And you know, just the idea of it being a little bit separate. You know, tilapia is not a native fish, and we're dealing some with you know, invasive species here ourselves. So there's some research that needs to be done there, but I think it's a resource that is probably underutilized right now. And honestly, there's so much problem with just the fish consumption advisories. The introduction of PFAS as maybe a regulated chemical is going to even compound that. And so, yeah, it's something that we're aware of, investigating of, and as far as being a solution right now, I don't know how viable it is, but I know it's always on the table.
And yeah, in the Pacific Northwest, there's an organization called the Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission that has been managing the salmon population for, I think, the past 2 or 3 decades. But along with that, they're not just dealing with salmon, but they're looking at seal populations, oyster populations, invasive species on riverbanks, changing how the rivers flow so that the salmon can produce better. So they've been doing these kind of aqua scale adaptation strategies for quite a while. But the thing that they need the backing mostly of is good, solid policy and how you can use the larger kind of solutions through policy implementation. So Ma'Ko'Quah, would you mind talking a little bit about how policy can help with adaptation strategies?
So like Mark mentioned, there's a lot of work being done on the ground specifically. And I mentioned this in my talk that yes, there's a lot of research that still needs to be done. When you're talking about indigenous communities and connection to the land, it's not the same land everywhere. Pacific Northwest is not the same. They're not dealing with the same issues that Plains tribes are dealing with or the Northeastern tribes are dealing with. You're talking about different vegetation, water quality issues. So EPA has documented that water that flows through the reservations in Kansas come out cleaner than when before they ran through the reservation, before the water flowed through the reservations. So there is different practices, indigenous knowledge being applied. An example of that is the Ojibwe, where they worked with their city, Duluth. There was a river that they wanted to dam, and the fish that were important to the Ojibwe people were essentially going to be, they weren't going to be able to swim their normal path, their habitat, their natural habitat. So they worked with the city and they determined that the best way to deal with that was to have a dam that closed at increments, not all at once. And so they built fish ladders. So, you know, alongside the dam, they built fish ladders for the fish to do that. And so that's applying indigenous knowledge to policy. I thought that's a great example that a community worked with municipal policies to implement that indigenous knowledge into practice. One of the things that they do with the Ojibwe is they have found that using old mattresses, the wires in the old mattresses, they use that to dredge their water sources. And they have cleaner water sources than nearby water sources. So the lakes on the reservation are cleaner, they have better water quality than the surrounding lakes. And so, you know, approaching indigenous communities as learning what they're doing. And, you know, the indigenous knowledge may not be shared, but you can tell there's community buy-in. You know, somebody in the community contributed to that idea. And so that community engagement is key. And you're not going to get indigenous knowledge shared with policy unless you consult with the communities. Consultation on the ground looks a lot worse than you talk about it, you know? And so redefining what consultation means and consulting in a way that incorporates indigenous knowledge, that's key.
Great. So we've got a couple of questions about non-Indigenous communities and how they can do things like support Indigenous adaptation, what types of things kind of foundationally that they need to, like non-Indigenous people need to like know. but also like best practices for collaboration. So one of you could maybe talk about some of your experiences with those types of collaborations with your communities. That would be wonderful.
Yeah, sure. And Ma'Ko'Quah brought up the Ojibways and the Anishinaabe peoples came up with a climate adaptation menu. I put a link on that in the chat. It was one of those documents that I read that was really changed how I look at writing adaptation plans and interacting, not just with the community at large, but with the other tribes in our region. It's an absolutely fascinating document for me, who's used to putting everything in the framework of a FEMA spreadsheet or something to present to the government, and realizing that we don't have to do that. We can do it our way. And this is an excellent example of that. And if you have some time, click on the link and download it. It's a PDF, and it really does show exactly how they are going to adapt. And it's a regionally wide, it's regionally applicable as they look at some of the different strategies that they're going to have as they face threats to, real resources. And, we've dealt with the Sac and Fox, we've dealt with some of the watershed districts in Nebraska, and with some of the emergency response districts in Kansas. It's a matter of us reaching out and building relationships. And it works the other way too. With the emergency response, we've had a lot of interest just because they see the work that we're doing and want to be a part of it. And so we've been able to share with them, and it's become a pretty good relationship, as we learn about what the abilities and capacities of each other are.
So for me, one of the things that I think is incredibly important about working with Indigenous communities is the concept of collaboration, is the concept of partnership. One of the things that tends to happen when non-Indigenous community members try to go into Indigenous communities, they try to take over. They try to say, we're the experts and you need to be doing things like this, like this, like this, when that doesn't always align with the community's culture. So when I go to a community to talk about renewable energy, I engage with their cultural values, because if a technology or a plan is more in line with a community's culture, it's more likely to be a successful project. And so being willing to listen, being willing to ask questions, and to accept the position of not being the expert, not being the person who comes in front with a top-down solution, but somebody who really wants the kind of ground up, we're willing to listen. We're willing, what can we do to support you in your solutions, as opposed to coming in and trying to implement your own solutions, I think is really key. And focusing on balancing that partnership where it's more equitable, and it's a give and a take. It's an exchange of ideas, as opposed to coming in and saying, this is the way to do this. And you see that in academia a lot of times, especially with the tensions between Western science knowledge systems and traditional knowledge systems. The kind of scientific method process of testing and retesting and hypotheses and theories, but not taking into account the traditional ecological knowledge, is, several generations of observed data that has been collected and passed down. So it's a huge data set that is not respected because it doesn't go through the same process that Western science knowledge goes through. So being able to, and the truth is, it's the real value is by incorporating both of those knowledge systems and having them work together and not be at opposed to each other, not being at odds.
I want to piggyback on what Dr. Dunaway says, because traditional ecological knowledge is subjective to the community itself. And when we're talking about working with learning Indigenous knowledge, you have to understand how these communities communicate. There's a lot of storytelling. It's a modern way of keeping winter counts. This oral history, these oral stories that's being told, that is the traditional ecological knowledge. And that is what needs to be, those themes need pulled out of this, put into a policy and implemented to protect and incorporate these values of each community. And that's difficult to do. But as you can see, we're all working on the ground on different issues. And I want to point that out, that we have academia, we have policy, we have planning on this talk. And these are different levels that Indigenous people are working on these issues.
Okay, so we have a question about how to get more people with our expertise into these types of forums. And the first thing off the bat that I just want to address is there's a lot of Indigenous scholars and Indigenous community workers out there. We just need the invitations and the opportunity to be a part of these conversations and to have those kind of cross-cultural communications. I'll let Mark move on with his kind of perspective.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more, Dr. Dunaway. The idea of being invited to an event like this is really new to me. The most of my presentations are there's usually a government tribal liaison involved, and that's where we get our invitations from. There doesn't seem to be there seems to be a lot of disconnect, I guess, between various agencies and groups. And unless there's a specific tribal liaison or someone looking at maybe an environmental justice community, we really don't have the opportunity to share. And I really appreciate your idea about creating an ethical space where this traditional ecological knowledge is not looked at as supplementary or complementary to research that's been done in a lab and peer reviewed. This ethical space exists where that knowledge is given every bit as much value as anything else on the table.
I want to talk about, there's a lot of issues in Indigenous communities. The stereotype, the mascot comes into play because non-Indigenous people don't know the work that's going on in Indigenous communities. They don't know the complex context that Indigenous communities are employing for themselves. And so taking an interest in learning some of these complex practices that are based on traditional values, but they're modernized. And that's what's happening in Indigenous communities. And so engaging with these practices, why they're doing it this way, that goes a long way to better understanding cultural values and incorporating that. And I always go back to policy because that's the legacy that we're going to leave. When our work is done, we're going to pass it on to somebody. I want a legacy. I want a policy that I know protects Indigenous people's rights to the land, something that incorporates their cultural values. And that's important because they can't do the work that they're doing without those legal protections. And so there's a specific way to write policy, there's enforcement, there's making sure that there's accountability to protect Indigenous communities' practices and allowing them to implement these practices on the ground without any barriers. There's a lot of barriers, and like Mark said, there's some disconnect going on there.
And I think one of the issues with policy is that for a long time, policy was used as a colonial tool to keep Indigenous communities from creating their own solutions. And with communities raising up, taking ownership of their own sovereignty and saying, you know, we have our own experts, we have our own solutions, we have our own ideas of how things need to be done. They need to be able to author their own policy and be able to design their own solutions. But they're fighting an uphill battle because there is this colonial legacy that's implemented into the fabric of how these communities have been treated since the founding of the United States. So I think that it's really interesting to kind of address things from that sort of perspective, as well as that, you know, looking at not going to the past, but moving forward in order to find kind of these solutions and find these new ways to merge knowledge systems and things like that. Sorry, I thought, Ma'Ko'Quah, did you have something to say, or did you want to move on?
Oh, no, there was a question here in the chat and I was trying to answer it. There is, so there's two questions going on. It's important that Deb Haaland is Department of Interior. You know, you got to understand the absurdity that we are listed under the Department of Interior, which is also the Department of Natural Resources. So what does that say to policymakers? And they deal with that with us. When you talk about supporting Indigenous communities, the EPA's portion, their small percentage of their budget that goes to tribal communities is constantly being cut. And so the money that tribes get to implement these best management practices are constantly under threat. And so somebody like Deb Haaland in this position, she understands those issues and understands the importance of an EPA budget increase percentage to tribes. That's what's going to build that adaptive capacity that we need. You know, policy has been used against tribal communities, but when we're talking about resilience and moving from poverty to sovereignty, then policy is going to enforce that at every step of the way. And that those legal mechanisms are what's needed. Allow tribes to adapt on their own terms. Allow tribes to self-determine for themselves what their resilience that Mark brought up. We're working on those solutions. Some have already implemented it. Tribes are at different adaptive capacity. And so supporting and encouraging these departments to direct more resources to tribes, that is a key to supporting Indigenous knowledge in communities.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And the idea of, you know, having Deb Haaland with the Interior Department and heading up the that cabinet position, it really goes to you know, what we see happening every once in a while is when we do have objections to policy, when the tribes do have a concern that maybe rises above the standard condition of the policy, we're quite often as seen as rocking the boat or being uppity, and having someone that won't look at tribes in that manner, as you know, realizing this is a real concern, let's solve the problem, let's not look at it as someone just trying to cause problems. I think it could generate an entirely different cooperative mindset than we have. It maybe less of a caretaker role and more of a realizing that there is a treaty trust responsibility to the tribes that the government doesn't always acknowledge quickly enough.
And kind of along with that, being under the Department of Interior, it inherently kind of puts Indigenous communities as this thing to be managed like a forest, like an agriculture system. And it puts us not at the position to be able to implement our own solutions, but to be managed. And that really is kind of the paradigm shift that we're hoping that will happen with the new Secretary of Interior, is that it can be more of a cooperative relationship. It looks like Michelangelo's on to cut us off. Thank you guys for the opportunity.